So we're moving to section 4 of our internal controls chapter. Here we're looking at fraud, errors and waste and impact. So in one sense what we're doing is sort of concluding in the area of concerns. What areas can go wrong for a business when we think about an internal control system? Several. So first things first, when we think of fraud and errors, really, there's a number of areas that businesses should watch and that are most susceptible, if you will. Now, we're generalizing, of course, but certainly this is a pretty good list. Now, procurement being one. In other words, the payment of invoices, the buying function within a business. Outside of that, certainly errors in the area of financial reporting, misstatements, for example, or incorrect use of accounting policies, or perhaps creative use of accounting policies. Certainly the safeguarding of assets of the business. So we know that we have a separate legal entity, we have assets within that entity, and we know that the board of directors have a stewardship role. A stewardship role simply means that they should be stewards over assets in effect that are not their own. They should guard those assets. Outside of that, clearly there is a fiduciary duty, or indeed, cash and other properties like us assets held in a fiduciary capacity. In other words, one of trust. We're tasked as board directors with guarding what the company owns. Outside of that, in terms of waste, what do we mean by that? Well, we're talking about, I guess, careless or extravagant use, possibly maybe private use, but it doesn't have to be, or use for no real purpose at all. And there's a number of examples how waste can occur, not least, obviously, in terms of just errors, possibly in terms of transportation, idle time, etc., and indeed linked into that waiting, any form of waiting. So there are a number of common wasteful practices in organizations, and we should be doing everything that we can to eliminate them. Here's just one suggestion. You will be familiar with lean principles and indeed this sort of impact of, let's say, Japanese manufacturing from the 1970s and the 1980s onwards. So these principles, the 5S, are fairly straightforward. Unfortunately, in my experience of ACCA exams, students find it difficult to remember them all. I think it's a good idea. They're not overly complicated. We're really talking about sort of, in the first instance, have a structure, really organize and eliminate anything that is unnecessary. Keep it simple, keep your system simple. Outside of that, scanning, or indeed, if you will, sanitizing. So constantly looking for things that are not in the right place, something that's out of place, or maybe a way to perform a task better. Number 4, standardize. So, once we've sorted and simplified, set simple standards and procedures in the workplace. And indeed, outside of 1 to 4, a high degree of self-discipline is required also in terms of guarding against waste. Now, in terms of the environment, we've talked a little bit about fraud and indeed susceptible business areas and businesses, a little bit about waste. What about the environment? Well, we know how important the environment has become. We've touched on that in other areas of the syllabus. If we look to ISO 14001, it has a framework that we could use to manage the sort of possible impacts, certainly in the long term, but also short and medium term as well. I mean, first things first, we know that some requirements, some regs are mandatory and some are not. This differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but certainly, adherence to and compliance with all and any regulations is an absolute must in the first instance. Outside of that, we should have objectives. in this area. Now, this is difficult. This is difficult for businesses because this is an area that's not so much new, but sort of not as well defined as it could be. So we have to try to set in some way. It could be emissions, it could be waste, it could be impact on local community, etc., etc. Outside of that, defining internal processes to achieve those objectives is key. And indeed, looking at the external or indeed outsource processes, notwithstanding the internal processes that have been established. So given the third and fourth here, any training requirements that we need should be also considered. And indeed, over and above that, in the course of time, we should monitor, analyze, and improve measures where we can. Let's move on from here to our conclusion. So what have we talked about in terms of this particular chapter? Well, we've talked broadly speaking about the internal management control system. We talked about what internal controls are and what they're supposed to do. And if you remember, everything really loops back round to the achievement of overall corporate objectives, which is, broadly speaking, the director's job. So an internal control system, a solid, or if you will, to quote Turnbull, a sound system, is going to be one that does just that. Now, I would certainly say that this chapter and indeed the next one are quite important to us. I'd certainly favour chapter 19 in the audit area because of the involvement of the audit committee slightly more. Okay, so I hope you found that helpful. Many thanks for listening and good luck with your studies.